Hi, everyone. Welcome back to part two of this conversation about the last conversation about cancel culture with Professor Joe Marchia. Thank you again, Professor Marchia, for taking time out of your day to come here and have this conversation with us. So in part two, we want to talk about what should we be talking about instead of cancel culture, right? So in part one, we talked about how if we parse it out into its finest parts, cancel culture isn't one thing, it's many things, and we can just label those things as they are, then we won't need the concept of cancel culture anymore. So we have the accountability and public power aspect of it, where we are using our voices to hold influential people accountable. And then we have the online culture aspect of it, which is where we interact and communicate with one another online. And we do use tropes from the accountability holding, the canceling into these online spaces and conversations in ways that sometimes hurt each other and ourselves in mostly Twitter and the comment sections of forums and such other spaces, Facebook groups and whatnot. So first, I wanted to talk about the principles of restorative justice. This is this idea, and if you want to talk about it, Professor Marchia, you can fill in, and then I have a question for you. But just to summarize, restorative justice is an idea that if we want, somebody to correct their thoughts or behaviors or actions, then the most effective way to do it is to help them learn, truly authentically learn why what they did was wrong or bad or whatever, and how they can move past it and become more productive members of society. It's sort of like an against punishment sort of justice, right? Instead of punishing someone, we restore them, make them functional members of society. So this is a actual idea that many scholars and policymakers are engaged in the offline base world, and their hope is that eventually we can change our horrific law enforcement and criminal justice system into something that's more humane, like restorative justice in the real world, right? But my question is to you, Professor Marchia, do you think that if we can't even do that online, what is the hope that we can do it offline? Is there some degree of how can we practice doing something like restorative justice online to begin with, where we're not really engaging beyond those 2D snippets? What is the value of doing it online to prove even to ourselves that we as a society are capable of even doing it offline? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's two different ways of looking at it. So I think it's easy. Oh, it's easier to do online because online is just easier to work through these problems. It's more expedient. But I think, as we were talking about before, the idea of your online self is so two-dimensional compared to your 3D self, and I think that makes people less likely to think about restorative justice in that way, right? The idea of uh, finding some way of solving this problem that benefits the victims and the perpetrator, right? That sort of resolves this in a way that's mutually beneficial, right? Because everyone has some sort of stake in it. I think that's almost sometimes in some ways harder to do online because we're not as interested in it, right? Because we're not sort of interested in making a person whole, and we're not viewing them as a whole person to begin with. But that being said, it is just actually easier to do if we're not talking about the criminal justice system, right? So now we're just talking about ways of interacting with each other, right? And so it's also a place or a space where we could maybe begin to practice that. Um, I would hope maybe it would be a way that, maybe there could be restorative justice culture in the way that we talk about. I mean, I don't know what that would be exactly, but right, maybe we could start to think about um, uh, accountability in this way, and looking at harm and repair and accountability in a way where we view it as not sort of it's not a zero-sum game, right? Like there's a mutual benefit, you know, I would say, and the theorists of this would say that to having the perpetrators of harm learn from it, right? There's some way that that's going to make them a better person, and it can also, provide some sort of healing for the victims of this type of whatever the offense is as well.
Yeah, for the victim as well. And that's where I haven't read too extensively on this, so don't quote me on this, but there's a study, there has been a study happening in Colombia by Shamus Khan, a sociologist, and he's been studying restorative justice at the campus in relation to campus instances of sexual harassment or violence. And parts of that study have found that restorative justice approaches are more healing for the victims of these incidents, because the alternative is that maybe they come out, maybe they speak up, maybe they report, which is already very hard for victims to do. Victims are afraid to report for various reasons, right? Sometimes the perpetrator might be somebody they actually don't want to get in trouble because it's somebody they're close with, or whatever reason victims are afraid to report because the punishments can be so severe. But if there's a restorative approach, then victims are more likely to come out and report it, and that puts them sometimes in a position to heal from this experience better. And also knowing that, okay, I had this terrible experience, and so I didn't also then throw this other person under the bus, even though they are causing me to be brutalized, or sorry, that's a really brutal way to say it, like experience harassment in any way, but it does have some effect if the person is not going to face severe like negative consequences, but rather the person is going to be having to learn how to move past these toxic and violent behaviors. And so knowing that has in some of these studies definitely shown that it's really helpful for some victims, not all, right? This doesn't apply. I'm sure there are various victims of various things that really do prefer to have more like traditional sort of punishment oriented justice, but this is new. This restorative justice stuff is really new, and people are really responding well to it. And I think it is partly because it starts from the position that people are capable of learning and growing and moving past the things they do that are troubling, because I don't think that we take that approach enough in society broadly, but especially online. Like online, I don't think there's a culture of expecting growth or facilitating growth. And I think that's a misstep. Like that's a real missed opportunity, I think, for something we could have. So the question is then, like, if we wanted to change the way we hold accountability online, especially for each other, maybe not so much for like the celebrities, but like for each other, like how would we start? And I had some ideas and I wanted to run them by you and see what you thought. So I think the absolute first thing to do would be to distinguish between expressing our emotions online versus reacting to other people's emotions, right? So like we all want space for our emotions and place to talk about how we're feeling. And even if those emotions are really like tense and angry, which right now it's common for people to feel those ways, that versus reacting when somebody else is having an emotion, no matter what that emotion is, no matter what somebody is pissed about or angry about, or if there's an insult going off about women in like a very toxic way, like we can just go somewhere else on the internet. There's no reason to like verbally and visually and publicly react to that and draw further attention to that. What do you think of this idea of like minimizing online reactivity? Because emotion happens offline, right? So when you see something online and then somebody says something really annoying or really like problematic or really like bigoted even, then it makes you feel a certain way, but how you feel is the feeling is experienced offline in your physical three-dimensional body, but the like act of indiscretion is happening online, and you can react by you can have emotions without visibly and publicly reacting.
Yeah. I guess it depends on the circumstance. There's ways of reacting that are defensive, right? And if you react in a defensive way, usually those online debates don't go anywhere, and usually, both parties tend to get more defensive and more entrenched. I remember that there was an experiment I read about where I think it was done by a sort of AI bot, but essentially it was like programmed to look and find instances of people that used I think in this study experiment, it was derogatory racial slurs, and the bot essentially would, track it down and say something. I don't know. It's programmed to have a few different things, but to just essentially be like, "Hey, this hurt my feelings," or "Hey, I didn't like it." And they found that this was often something that people responded to, right? And again, not to sort of in any way say that you know you're wrong to feel angry about someone using that type of language, right? But in terms of like, how do we sort of maybe try and look at a way of changing things in a way that people are going to be responsive to, and that could maybe be a sort of holistic, restorative way of dealing with the problem. You know, these online engagements where people get defensive aren't usually very productive, and they're reactive, right? And they sort of, both parties get their emotions out sort of very immediately, but it's not it doesn't serve both parties at the same time. It's not sort of mutually beneficial. It's sort of two people talking past each other. And in terms of, dialogue, ways of, it could be productive if there's, an actual dialogue happening, and then it could also be unproductive in that it requires both parties to be invested, right? If one person's just trolling you with awful things, then, I mean, react however you want to react. But in terms of being productive, sometimes you just have to not go and just not react and just not, log off and not look at it and not engage with people that are not going to be interested in having any sort of productive conversation. So it depends, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's like, yeah, there are situations where you can say something and it be productive. So I'm not saying like never react, never respond. Like, what I'm saying is if you see something online and it makes you feel very angry, very like negative emotions become sort of the key thing that you're feeling, then that might not be the best moment to try to tell this person what they're doing is wrong or engage with them, because their emotions are probably already heightened, and then so if yours are also heightened, then people can't have calm logical discussions, like productive conversations, as you've been talking about, like conversations that lead to some sort of change when emotions are heightened. Because when emotions are heightened, we become very enmeshed in them, and then expressing that into this like 2D medium, we are likely to like let that emotion carry over in a way that doesn't actually help either, right? Like you're saying, either party. So I was thinking about counterpoints again because I assigned that video to my students for critical engagement with it. She, at one point, she was talking about her own self-cancellation, how she got caught in a storm of saying problematic tweets, and some of them she apologized for, some of them she stood by, whatever she, that's up to her. But like at one point she said, I said this thing after I felt this swarm of like Twitter mob like just come at me. I got so emotional and reactive that I said something that I truly regret, like that I really wish I hadn't said, like this horrible thing that I just wish I had never like expressed. And because she was very upfront about what she didn't apologize for, like what she did apologize for was something that she said that was coming from a place of pure reactivity. And that made me think like, okay, so a lot of the time some people like say things that are horrible because they are like really not in a good emotional place, like they're just like really like struggling in that moment, and then they like end up making these like big like mistakes and like saying these like horrible things. That is like acting in defense, right? That's what happens when we act in defense. Like defense is this like intense desire to shield ourselves from harm in a way that we will say and do anything it takes. And then it brings us to these places where we end up engaging in types of conversations we don't even want to engage in, but we find ourselves saying that in defense. So like that's something I'm talking about when I say reactivity, that like recognition that at this point in this conversation or this online engagement, my emotions are so strong and heightened that my only recourse here is to stop engaging, because if I don't, then I'm liable to saying things that I truly don't even want to say, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That if you're in that sort of defensive state, you may say things that even you don't agree with, right? Because something else is, that emotional reaction, uh, and that defensiveness may make you, just literally say things that you don't mean, right? Because the sort of, whether or not there's some sort of actual justice-based or political element, right? Once that sort of defensiveness becomes the priority of the interaction, which is something that happens a lot on the internet, right, with our two-dimensional selves, right? Then if that's taking priority, then we're not always going to speak our minds as clearly and as truly as we want.
Right, or as authentically. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what conflict is, right? Even offline, like how many of us have like fought with our parents or partners, and like just like the fight, the conflict gets heated, and then you're like screaming at one another, and before you know it, you're saying things you really, really don't mean. Like that's just what conflict does. When you're in a conflictual situation, you say things that you regret and you don't mean. And like online, there's so much conflict. There's so much internal conflict that like the first step in even trying to talk about restorative justice is taking accountability for our own behavior and taking accountability for our own emotions, right? We are all responsible for our own emotional health, and in as much as others can make we can make each other sick, emotionally unwell online, we also actively participate in making ourselves sick online, right? By being so reactive, by taking these positions and literally guarding it with our lives, and that's not healthy. So that's a place to start. I think a place to start is like take account of our own reactivity, and I think being less reactive online is possible for every single one of us. And it doesn't mean don't have feelings, because again, feelings happen offline. Feelings are completely occurring to our 3D self, so we don't need to transpose those feelings onto the screen all the time. I mean, yeah, there's moments when we want to express our feelings online, and that's fine if we're doing it from a place of like passion or compassion or a desire to express ourselves. But if we're doing it from a place of sort of like a reactive defense mechanism, then it's likely that it will lead to mentally and emotionally unhealthy places.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So that was just like my thoughts on where to start. Obviously, none of this is like research based, because nobody studies this for whatever reason, sociologically anyway. But I wanted us to think about, that's why we're doing this class assignment, right? So that we can all collectively think about it and draw from Professor Marchia's experience with social theory and the internet as well, to like think about what are some things we can do to make the internet a better place, and instead of cancel culture, make internet culture about, I don't know, what did you call it? Justice culture? Restorative justice? Restorative culture?
I think I made something else up. I don't know. It was one of
Yeah.
those.
I mean, this is part of the project. Either by the end of this conversation, one of us will come up with what to call this new culture, or the students will come up with it in their assignment, right? So the next thing I wanted to talk about is social justice, which comes into the heart of all of this. So when I think of social justice online, what comes to mind to you?
um, Social justice online, as in that happens, or just whatever first comes to mind.
What first comes to mind? Yeah, like not, yeah, not critical.
Yeah.
It's just,
I think I usually think of social movements that start online or have gained traction online that take off a lot. Um, stuff that I'm sure you've been talking about: Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Arab Spring, and really a lot of social movements have an online component now. Um, Online discourse has moved a lot of conversation. Um, so I think, it's a big part of how the internet uh, works today, I think. You don't have to look too far to see how much social justice issues are really forefronted online. even if you don't necessarily go to it for that, I mean, we see, I think we live in a time where things are very political. People are very politically minded. Um, so yeah, I mean, those few social movements and just a general increase in dialogue, I guess.
Yeah. So, see, when you think about it, because you're a sociologist and a professor of theory, you think social movements, which is what I think when I think about social justice online. But I think a lot of people, and this is predominantly maybe like, conservatives, but also people on all sides of the political spectrum think when they think about social justice online, I think some people mean individually talking every single individual we encounter on the internet out of their bigoted ways of thinking. And that's a losing battle, right? Like, because that's, again, we talked about it, we're not going to solve these issues on the internet via extremely absurd, extremely online comment threads on Reddit or Twitter or however. That's not how the Arab Spring happened. You mentioned the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring was a set of revolutions that took place in the Middle East, starting in Tunisia and Egypt in the early 2010s. And we are going to read a whole book about it and do a case study of the Arab Spring revolutions in relation to digital media and social movements. That revolution started because a video of a fruit seller who set themselves on fire because of extreme poverty and dissatisfaction with their government. That video went viral, and then as a result, the whole country sort of hit the streets, and it ended up in toppling over several dictatorships. Here this year with the Black Lives Matter movement, the video of, trigger warning, the brutal murder of George Floyd by a police officer also, went viral on the internet. That resulted in a series of protests, right? So in both cases, something happened, some piece of information was shared in a completely new way that was not possible prior to the internet. And when that happened, it allowed people to create social bonds that were in support of one another, that led to an actual offline social movement. So one thing I want to encourage students and anybody watching this to do, and I want you to think about it and tell me what your thoughts are as well, is that instead of spending a tremendous amount of time and energy arguing with individuals on the internet, what if people thought about using the internet to figure out alternative ways to address the social institution that the individual represents? So if somebody is saying something really racist and being a troll on the internet, instead of trying to fix that person's racism, because we're not going to, we think, okay, what can I do on the internet that will allow me to challenge racism on a much broader scale? And then maybe that leads you to maybe organizations that deal with racism offline, like political organizations or social organizations that you can join online that then actually do actions online. Entire revolutions have been kicked off now via this kind of organizing. So I think that's something to think about. Every time an individual does something that makes you upset on the internet, instead of trying to fix them, think about, what can I do now to fix the problem they represent? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? I mean, for two reasons. I mean, first of all, like you said, it's really hard to just change one person's mind online. And second of all, it's not efficient, right? I mean, if racism, for example, is structural and systematic, and I mean, you could imagine how impossible it is to change someone's mind over the internet. And even if you were to somehow succeed, one in a thousand times, that doesn't change a lot of the structural factors. I mean, where does someone like that come from? Well, it comes from the structure and the culture and the systemic racism and the ideas that permeate, the society we live in. So, one place to take that sort of, as we're thinking about something like that, that emotional response you may have, and well earned of anger or whatever towards seeing perhaps like a racist comment online, could be fuel for funneling that into doing something offline that's really important, that could really try that could make really big changes. If you take that energy and you apply it in a way that's very productive instead of, taking this sort of instant gratification route of, immediately trying to do it through the comments. And, maybe people don't consciously think that they are changing the world through comments, but, that energy, energy for some sort of social justice is exhausted through doing it that way. So I think you're absolutely right that, one of the best ways is to take that and apply it in a productive direction, which is towards, the structure. Who are these? Where does someone like this come from? That, this is one person, but there's a reason that, racist people exist. Well, structural racism, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then like, where does this person come from? What social institution they represent? Like, and then, we reach structural racism, and then it's like, okay, there's a pandemic. What can I do about structural racism? Then you might be reinforced in the idea to go and try to, attack one racist at a time on the internet. But that's, like you said, it's super inefficient. That's the most important point here, right? It's like so inefficient. It almost never works, and very rarely, if it works, then it's the energy to like change ratio is very small. You like changed one person, and like you said, like that energy, like, even if people think, okay, you know what, I can do this in the comment section and I can do it offline, like if you are one of those people that can, more power to you. But to me, it seems that a tremendous amount of collective energy is being just poured into these debates online, where nobody, neither party is listening to the other, where that energy, like you said, could be repurposed to doing something that would challenge these structures offline. But you can still use the internet to access those channels, is the cool thing about the internet, right? Like, there are lots of groups that are working offline, that are recruiting online, that are like engaging online in actual social movements, and you can join them, you can learn about them on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, yep, you can organize online, and, yeah, ostensibly you could do both. But when you think about, when you have that heightened energy of seeing injustice, how productive it could be to funnel that into organizing, and organizing online too, right? I mean, if you're, you could immediately start talking to an organizer in, your area or a different part of the world, right? Or try and set something up, but something that, that's where I would say that energy could be funneled in a very productive way.
Yeah, and it's also like instant gratification is something you mentioned. Like, we're not about to solve racism or sexism today on the internet. Like, if it was so easy, then we would have done it by now. It's this sort of large scale, long term structural change takes a lot of time, patience, and committed energy. Burnout is something many people who are inclined to engage in social justice experience, because it's freaking tiring and depressing to think about how everything in the world is like complicated and not the way we want it to be, and so many people are hurting and suffering, right? Like, that's exhausting. So on top of that, if we're using all of this energy trying to like go after one comment after another, one person at a time, that's, I mean, to me, anytime I've done that sort of activism, let's call it, like, I've been very tired. It has made me less available for other forms of social engagement that have been more productive in my experience. And at this point in my life, I'm just like, I don't know if that's a necessary or productive thing to do, unless you are a part of like a social organization that is doing active propaganda online, and that is your job. Like, you've taken on the official role from a structured, organized point of view, right? So you're like, okay, we're part of this organization. My job is to go around teaching people in comment section, and that's my role as part of this organization. I'm not going to take that personally. I'm just going to do this as a form of propaganda. That's different. But it's just like everybody at random with no ideological coherence going around like trying to change the world one Twitter debate at a time. To me, it's just like super unproductive, and it's just, there is other ways to do it, and it's right there on the internet. That's what perplexes me. Yeah. Sorry, I got in a little bit for you.
No, I agree.
Yeah. So basically, the point I'm trying to make here is to use the internet to join grassroots organizations that are working to challenge the social institutions that perpetuate these toxicities at all levels. And when someone says something offensive, do one more thing that day to support this other like movement or organization rather than feeding the troll. What do you think of when I say feeding the troll? What comes to mind?
Well, yeah, you also have people that just deliberately want to, use up your energy, because, right, I mean, a troll online is someone that just wants to sort of get you to react, and in that case, you don't have two defensive people. You have one person that just wants to get a sort of rise out of you and have you be defensive, and that's all they're there to do. They're not even necessarily there to argue the oppositional viewpoint in good faith. They just sort of want to extend your energy for their own amusement, and that's maybe the least productive thing you could do is engage with someone like that.
Yeah, exactly. You brought up this concept of good faith, and that comes up a lot in terms of online debate, right? What do we mean by somebody arguing in good faith? Like, what is that?
Right. Yeah. So good faith would be someone who's authentically, expressing their viewpoint. And usually we talk about it in terms of an argument. An argument could be in good faith or bad faith. A good faith would be, you're arguing with someone and you may disagree, right? But they are authentically expressing where they're coming from. Bad faith is usually when they're not really interested in having a dialogue. They want to, um, just provoke, or they find it somehow entertaining to pretend to have a certain point of view, or they're arguing in order to get you to admit something, or they're arguing one point actually because they have some other hidden agenda.
Right, right. So it's this like inauthentic, like just pseudo engagement almost to like get a rile out of the opposition. And good faith is when you're genuinely interested in learning and growing from the experience. So that is my sorry dog barking. I don't know if y'all can hear that.
It's
Apologies.
okay, this dog is here too.
It's okay, buddy. You have a friend. So this actually leads into the next segment and the next thing I wanted to talk about. What's wrong, buddy?
Sorry. Okay. There you go.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry, students. I'm just gonna pause this recording real quick, see what's going on because he doesn't usually do that. He was just barking in his sleep. I'm sorry for that doggy interruption. Okay, sorry. So I was gonna like lead into this conversation about, some people might say we need to educate each other on the internet. That's part of internet citizenship, right? Education, and that's certainly true to a great extent. But I wanted to ask you this question. ContraPoints talks about this, and I wanted to see your thoughts on this. She poses this question: are people on the internet motivated by moralism and intellectualism? What do you think?
um I mean, it really depends, right? I mean, some people are, some people aren't. Some people may be motivated by that, but then not act in accordance with that because they, maybe are motivated by other things, right? I mean, someone may have a very strong justice-based viewpoint, but also may, seek a conflict because, to be heard, right? I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit before, right? Sometimes people have a strong viewpoint, whether or not they even know about it, just to sort of, to be seen. And those two motivations can get tricky. And I mean, uh, I'm not even going to say like for myself or everyone I know, like, it's sometimes hard to even go through your own motivations, right? And you have to be sort of vigilant to make sure you're not sort of letting your own egoistic motives get in the way if you are motivated by a justice-based thing. So I really don't think it's an either or of, are they not, could get very complicated what people's motives are. And sometimes we don't even know what our real motives are.
Yeah, that's the like interesting thing. Like we really truly don't. A lot of the times we don't know why we're saying what we're saying. We just felt like it in that moment. And sometimes we do know, sometimes we do have a coherent ideological thread backing our that moment's whatever's making us emotional. But how can we know other people's motivations on the internet? How do we know what another person's motivation is?
I mean, the only way to do that is to sort of engage in good faith, and both people have to do that. It's you could, if people are able to have a real dialogue, you could sort of even figure out, let's say you clash on one issue in a really extreme way, if you could sort of, if people did take the time to see where the other person is coming from. I'm not saying that you end up being like, you think your thing, I think my thing, but if you find some sort of common ground, you might even be able to convince them that, your point is valid by their values, right? You have some sort of shared values, but how do you know what they know? How do you know where they're coming from? I mean, you have to really engage with them and really, you know, try and figure out, yeah, like their perspective. And that requires a lot of patience, and that requires not getting defensive. And that's tough. And there's some people whose views may be so abhorrent that we don't care to know, if they're, whatever, a neo-Nazi or something. I mean, you don't necessarily, not going
Yeah.
to really want to know their
Yeah.
perspective per se, but for people who maybe have like a more minute difference, sometimes you can learn about where they're coming from, learn what they know, and if they're open, you could educate them as well.
Yeah, so many different things you say here, right? Very important points. First of all, if you see somebody making comments that makes them seem like a neo-Nazi or an incel or any sort of like extreme position, then let's go back to the don't feed the troll suggestion, right? At
Yeah.
that point, you turn around and walk away because there's nothing to be talked about there. The other thing you talked about is getting to know what they know, this mutually good faith conversation that can build into something that teaches either party something. But my thought is, how often can we see both parties having mutually good faith conversations? I have not seen a lot of that. I've seen it sometimes and it's been wonderful. I just feel like most people don't go online and don't get into these debates online with the hopes of truly growing and learning in that moment. They might have, in a broader sense of their self, they might be interested in learning and growing, but in that moment, they forget about those intentions and they get so caught up in the minutia of whatever they're arguing. So what would you recommend to people in terms of learning to engage in good faith arguments, knowing that the other side might not respond well? And if they don't respond well, go back to the don't feed the troll, walk away, right? But how might somebody try to engage in these like good faith conversations?
um I think, I mean, one thing that maybe I've seen or that maybe I try and practice is to, if someone comments on something, to maybe like, start engaging with them in good faith and see how they respond. And if it seems like they're not interested in learning where you're coming from, then, you could sort of say, well, they're trolling, or they're, at least they're not, or they're not receptive, right? I mean, I've seen it sometimes happen where people respond in good faith trying to converse with this person, and the other person just does name calling, in which case, that you can't go anywhere from that. But sometimes, and it could be rare, you could, at least at the very beginning of a conversation, assume the other person also has good intentions and react to them as if that's true, right? Even if they have some viewpoint, you're like, how could you think such a thing, right? At least in the very beginning of that conversation, thinking, okay, this person probably means well. I'm going to engage with them in a way that uh, assumes that they want to learn. And if you see that they don't, and that's often the case, then that's it. Then you have your answer, right? Then the conversation is not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. That's really great. So like assuming good intentions, unless somebody makes such a statement that clearly they're not worthy of engaging in, and everybody's capable of drawing that line for ourselves, right? Like we know when somebody has crossed our boundaries and then we don't need to engage with them. But if somebody says something that we think we might be able to like teach them or learn from them or help them understand, then I think that you're totally right. Assuming that they have fine intentions is a good place to start. I mean, why do we have to be so antagonistic all the time? Like that's not what we would do offline, right? Offline we would at least try to be kind to a new person that we meet for the first time. We don't like immediately like start attacking them. So like, why would we do that online? I think it's a great advice to first think, okay, this person said something that is incorrect or inaccurate or offensive even, but this is just a snippet and there's a whole person behind the screen and I don't know anything about them. So why don't I try to learn about them a little bit before I try to teach them something? Because it's sort of this like mutually reinforcing process where multiple people are involved and other people are also watching, right? We can also lead by example, like by changing the way we approach others online, we can positively motivate other people to do the same thing. And maybe ultimately we can remove some of these toxicities from online communication. I think those are really, really wise and great points. And another thing you brought up that I really do want to talk about is about the boundaries of each person's knowledge, right? What does everyone behind the screen know? What does each person behind the screen know? How do we know what they know? Are we honest about what we know? Like, these are some questions. I mean, I guess these are questions about knowledge that we don't think about while engaging online. And since you brought that up, I wanted to see if you want to speak more about that, about like, how can we know what they know versus what we know?
What do you mean? How can we know what they know?
Well, first of all, we don't know what people know,
Yeah.
like, when they're talking to us, but how can we respect that fact when engaging with other people? How can we be mindful of the fact that we are not privy to every individual's like understanding of the total social reality that we occupy?
Oh, yeah, that's hard, and I think that's something that only happens through if you could successfully have a conversation, um, you know, through asking questions. I mean, yeah, a lot of times people have a very partial view of the world, and it's a lot of times just from a few different things they've heard. I mean, we're in a sociology class. We, you know, me and you and your students think about all this and study all this and have a very broad knowledge base, and maybe other people do as well, but not a lot of people don't. A lot of people sort of have just different things they've heard, and have sort of cobbled together a way of seeing the world as best they can, and through no fault of their own. I mean, not everyone studies sociology, right? And even if they don't study sociology, not everyone keeps up on politics, right? They maybe keep like an eye open, but they have other things that are the focus of their lives, and that's
Yeah.
valid enough. But one thing to consider is usually, when you're engaging with people, the fact that they they don't know everything, and neither do we, and we may know more, but we may have our own blind spots. But one thing to definitely consider is where people are coming from. When a lot of people form their political views, they're not in the way we might be picking between 50 different angles on an issue. Maybe they have only heard 2 or 3 different angles on an issue, or maybe they didn't even know it was an issue, or something. And so if they're kind of blinkered and they seem limited, it doesn't mean that they've sorted through all 50 options and came up with the worst one, right? They could just be someone that doesn't know. And that's also something to sort of think about when engaging in this way.
Yeah, and like you and I have evaluated, let's say, like 50 different ways of knowing and chosen the one we like best, because that's what we do. Like, our job is to study society and figure out what's true and what's not true about society. So obviously it makes sense that we come from a position of knowing a decent amount, but other people, and I'm not saying that like, because we are like academics, like we know a lot and others don't, but like, other people on the internet on the other side of the screen can range from somebody that gets all of their news from Twitter as headlines, and that's their extent of engagement with socio-political reality, to like people that might be reading 10 books a day and are speaking from a very coherent ideological position. We don't know where they fall when we're engaging with people online, right? We don't know where their knowledge base falls in this like broad, or they might just not even engage in politics at all, but they might just be like motivated by something they saw on the news today that's like making them want to talk about this. Like, there's a wide variety of knowledge bases, and I think since we can't know what others know or what level of knowing and knowledge they're coming from. I think we need to take better accountability for what we know and our own knowledge and our own limitations within that. So I want to ask you, what can we do? And not by we again, I don't mean you and me or like academic sociologists, but maybe students, maybe other individuals that might be engaging in on the internet. What is a good place to start in terms of being accountable for what we know and knowing more, making room for growth in our own knowledge base before like coming at another person for their limitations, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's always so much more that we can know. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, you know, even at a PhD level of sociology, one thing you really learn is that you may know, a, you know, a little bit about a lot of the field, but there's different aspects of the field, right? If you're someone that studies gender, you may not know about, I don't know, well, it's tough in sociology because a lot of things overlap, I guess. But
Yeah.
right, if you have one sort of little specific thing, let's say even gender and criminal justice system, maybe you don't know as much about migration and political economy. I know these things, but you know, and that's just sort of how it is. You're not always going to know everything about everything,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you have to sort of maybe even learn where your gaps in knowledge are, and you keep reading and you keep learning. And I mean, no one's going to have all the pieces. I mean, that's why conversation with others is so important, is because you know, no one person's ever going to have all the knowledge, right? I mean, you know, learning and discussing and figuring things out collectively is the only way to really move forward. And you know, even beyond just the internet, I mean, just a skill to cultivate and to learn for ourselves is to, you know, be able to recognize our limits and recognize the strength that there is in working collectively on a project. I mean, we might not all know everything, but we might all be committed to the same goals, and that's something that we could work collectively towards.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One thing we can try to know first is what the other person's goals are. And if they match our goals, and if they do, then they're worth engaging with. And if they don't, then again, we're wasting energy, right? But I think what you said is very insightful in terms of like collective knowledge building and knowledge production. And I mean, like, we're living in a society where education is not democratic in the way that some people might think. And, you know, we're not going to get too much into that right now, but like, internet is the one place where we can have democratic learning experiences, and by that I mean truly just like collectively share what we know. And if we found the like right boundaries for like everybody to express their knowledge and expertise, right? Everybody knows something because everybody comes from unique experiences, especially people in marginalized communities and people from marginalized backgrounds have a lot of experiences that translate to knowledge, even if it's not academic knowledge, right? This is why I think increasingly the suggestion from my end to a lot of people is, if you're not from a marginalized background, then listen, read the conversation. Don't try to jump into the conversation. Read the conversation, because people are coming from a wide variety of different experiences and perspectives, and they are sharing that with you right now, and that is an opportunity to learn as well. And so like, if we a respect other people's boundaries, and b recognize our own, and be like, okay, I don't really know a lot about what it means to be let's say like a gay person growing up in New York, right? Then I don't want to like engage in that conversation. I want to read the perspective of somebody who has had that experience. And conversely, like, you know, none of you might know what it feels like to grow up in Nepal. And so when it comes to that, then it makes sense to listen to me about that, right? So there's all these like different things people bring to the table, and there's the academic knowledge and there's the experiential knowledge. And on the internet we have a mishmash of all of that types of knowledge. We have people who have a lot of academic knowledge, that have read a lot of books in specific subjects, people who specialize in really really niche things that they know a lot about, people who've had really like unique experiences that teach them a lot. But unless we know how to know what somebody else knows, we're just going to be coming from these different perspectives and different lenses, and just like talking over one another and never listening, right? So like, recognizing the limitations of our own knowledge is a very good place to start, because again, we cannot be accountable for other people's behaviors on the internet. We can only be accountable for the most part for our own behaviors, right? So what's a good place to start is to know, okay, these are things I absolutely know a lot about because I had these experiences, or I've had this many years of training, or read this many books about this topic. But then everything else I defer to other people. If everybody started sort of taking that stance, I think it could go somewhere in terms of creating this collaborative learning environment that you're describing. What do you think?
Definitely. I think that's um, the goal of most activist organizations, or that's the structure of most activist organizations that at least um, are interested in this type of work. To do that and to have different people come and approach different problems and work through it, and have incorporating different places people come from, the different experiences they might come from, in a way that's productive. And these different perspectives and experiences don't have to just be conflict, doesn't have to just be uh, it doesn't have to be a problem that people come with these different things. It could actually be a useful and positive um, resource for whatever movement you're interested in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, for as far as the internet goes, a really great place to start is really just take stock and have an honest conversation with yourself about what you do know, right? And then anytime you're coming up upon a topic that doesn't fall into this is a strict category of my absolute knowledge, and that's going to keep growing as you grow as a person. Obviously, your box is going to grow. If it's not in your box, then listen, read, lurk. This, you can engage in internet in so many different ways, right? And the other thing that you can do is, and I'll have you can talk about this because you read a tremendous amount of books, Joe. You can read books. What happened to that? What happened to reading books? And there's so many free books online. What do you think about that? Using the internet to learn as a place to, like, find books, read them, or find about books.
There's I mean, there's a bunch of books available online. There's a bunch of I mean, there's blogs too, and blogs could not always be super reputable, but sometimes there'll be a blog about a book, or about synthesizing certain knowledge. I mean, there's a lot of stuff available for free, and um, books are usually more heavily vetted than blogs, so that's definitely something that you could check out. And I mean, it's helpful sometimes to read a book that's super tangential to what you're usually interested in, right? If you're interested in one specific area of society, right, and you read a lot about that and get a lot of knowledge, well, then sometimes also pick something up that's way out of your knowledge field, and learn something about that. And that's also a way to there's probably more connections than you think, and it gives you a broader knowledge perspective.
Yeah, and like from an energy expenditure perspective, like the 2 days spent going back and forth on Twitter about some obscure argument with some person that's like constantly draining one's energy. What would happen if those 2 days were spent reading a book about the topic that the person's arguing about? What do you think the energy differential there looks like?
Yeah, I mean, reading might not be as immediately satisfying, but it's something that could help. If you read something, right, you might not become an expert in that little area, but maybe the next time you have a conversation with someone, you have a little bit of perspective. And even if you just say, I don't know if this is right, but I do remember reading something about this. And so this is what I know about it. And, I don't know the whole picture, but I have a little bit of a glimpse into maybe what the other person is talking about.
Yeah, it's a way to, again, hold accountability for your own knowledge base and then build upon that. And in terms of like creating, expanding your box of what you know, I think it's very important to for people to start having coherent ideological beliefs. And what I mean by that is, like, instead of having beliefs that are full of contradictions, so saying Black Lives Matter, but then supporting US imperialism or the US state. Like those things are in contradiction, because you cannot both believe in the rights of Black people to live, and you cannot also believe in the superiority of the US empire that, you know, marginalizes and brutalizes this community. So right, that's a contradiction. So, you know, how do people learn to resolve these internal contradictions in the way that they think, and develop ideas that actually come from a coherent whole, like an ideological coherent whole? What, as your theory professor, like to you, I'm sure that question must be like pretty interesting, maybe a little too broad. And but what do you think? How can people start that? How can people start building on knowledge instead of like cherry picking opinions?
Yeah, I mean, I think one other important thing to, you know, developing some sort of political consciousness is to, yeah, I mean, not every sociological or social or political thing comes from the same perspective, and it may, you know, superficially align with other stuff you've read, but you know, you read and you absorb stuff and you keep what sort of works and you throw out stuff that doesn't, and you know, you have to sort of also weigh these things against each other. I mean, it's you know, part of building your own sort of ideological way of viewing the world is to question your own beliefs and question, you know, your beliefs against each other sometimes, right? Or question what you know against other things you know. And you know, unfortunately, a lot of people hold sort of contradictory ideas at the same time, and that's, you know, not a flaw. That's somewhat normal. I mean, that's something that, you know, people can have cognitive dissonance with different things, and sometimes you got to work through it and think through it and ask yourself hard questions, and sort of figure that out. So I think definitely, in addition to reading, you know, also asking yourself tough questions, and maybe even, you know, just because you've had one idea for a long time doesn't mean that it's necessarily correct. I mean, you know, your values are different, but in terms of like how you, what you know and what you've read and how you view a certain perspective on a problem, there could be an entirely different solution you never thought about. So yeah, so I would say definitely also take what you know and weigh it against other things, and you know, sort through it. That also helps you communicate with other people, right? If you're sort of lost in your own, you know, you say one thing and then you say something else that contradicts it, it confuses you and it confuses other people. So it's helpful to figure that out.
Yeah, yeah, and I like that you made this distinction between, you know, what did you just say? Values and ideology. And there's also like a difference between like value ideology and empirical reality, right? Find, to me, the way I developed my working hypothesis of how the world works is I thought about where my values intersect with empirical reality. Then what came out of that became my ideology, right? I didn't start with an ideology, because when we do that, then we become tied to the ideology, and then we are not capable of doing what Jojo said, which is challenging our own beliefs. We are all coming from a place where we have accumulated beliefs and attitudes and opinions based on the process of socialization, which is when you're born, your parents teach you things. When you grow up, you go to school, you learn things from your peers. These are all agents of socialization. These are people and groups that are teaching you things. And then there's the media, which is the ultimate agent of socialization in this day and age, because we're learning things from the media, from the internet, from each other online, right? Like these are all different dimensions of society that influence who we are, how we occupy a position within society, how we engage with society, right? These are all agents of our socialization. So whatever we think and believe, it comes from sort of a like pastiche of these influences in our lives, or like books we've read, or like college professors, right? Whatever we are telling you right now might now become a part of your pastiche. But that doesn't, just because we believe that, just because those are the things, bits and pieces we've picked up and we've made these beliefs around them, does not mean that they are true. So the best way to do is, you know, know that this pastiche creates your values are inherent to who you are as a person and they come from your socialization, then try to understand where your values meet empirical reality. And the way to do that is by making a commitment to challenging your beliefs when they are empirically wrong. So thinking that that the how do I put this delicately? So thinking that, okay, so free market capitalism, like a lot of people think that that's like this amazing thing for various reasons. That's what you've been, that's what you've been told your whole life. And you might say from like one perspective, like an economist might say like, oh yeah, because, market fundamentalism, the market decides how society should operate and it's been working really well. And what are we going to have alternatively? All of that like nasty Stalinism, like there's no alternative, right? We talked about this via capitalist realism. But if you think about it empirically and look at, okay, how many people are there in the world? How many people are thriving? Like that's just an empirical count, right? How many people are thriving? How many people are experiencing extreme poverty relative to how much wealth actually exists in real terms? Then you're going to have to question whether this free market capitalism is really working. And I'm not saying that from an ideological perspective anymore, although it does align with my personal values of equality. I'm saying it from a purely this is reality perspective, right? This is actual reality, is that there's a high concentration of wealth and there is disproportionate distribution. So how do you learn that? You learn that by questioning yourself as to why do I believe that free market capitalism is it? Do you have anything to add? Any examples maybe? Or anything else?
I think it's a great one. I think it ties into something we've already talked about. So maybe it's something, I think it's a helpful example for them.
Yeah, I hope they can connect it. So now you can connect our last set of conversations to this one, hopefully, to think about that. And I think this conversation about knowledge is very helpful. And so thank you for really engaging with that. So now I want to end and get into our final section, which is changing the narrative at the hyper-real online. Can it influence the real offline base? That's the question we started, right? When you think about hyperreality, there's no hyperreality like the internet. The internet is only hyperreality because reality is offline. So can we use this hyperreal space to affect this like offline society? So offline society is an imperialist capitalist hellscape full of hateful actions, bigotry. I'm just reading things I wrote down. Bigotry and massive inequality. Could online society be a respite of kindness, learning, and growth? And if it could be, then how? I mean, we talked about a lot of this, but if you had to like make a closing remark on that, like how could we do that?
Well, I think we talked about some of the ways that we could engage with each other better online, right? Different ways of viewing where other people are coming from, different ways of viewing how to sort of be committed to our values, but also in ways that don't perpetuate the negative stuff, right? And, the fact that online is kind of disembodied from our real life makes it sometimes hard to see, but if we practiced it, it's a good space to begin to practice that in, right? I mean, it's very easy to, go to that negative place online. But the flip side of that is it's actually easy to, I mean, it goes against what we're used to, but it's physically pretty easy to do, to do it online, right? To start even practicing these different models of engaging with other people online. With hopefully the idea that we could do it in person too, right? It's a space where we can begin to practice that in the same way that we've been using it as a space to practice our worst impulses. It could be a space to practice our best impulses.
Exactly. I think that's so brilliant and so true. And like then who knows what's gonna happen? I'm not saying it'll necessarily have like real world impact, but part of like a lot of like, our own worst tendencies offline are because of like capitalist realism, which is this like defeatist, hopeless like state of like nihilism and despair. If most of our time is spent online and we're just like being super nice to each other online and like learning and growing and being respectful and so forth, then it's likely to put a lot of us at a much better mental state that makes us more able to challenge capitalist realism offline, right? Theoretically, I'm not saying that this is possible and that I've done the research on this, but theoretically, you'd think if people are spending a bunch of time online and they're getting a lot of positive energy out of that, that their then engagement in actual society is gonna potentially be more positive, right? Theoretically, that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's an open question, right? I mean, the internet's only been around so long, and a lot of these are things we don't know for sure. But I think you're not going to know unless you actually try. At the very least, I do think practicing this way of relating to other people is something that I would say can spill over into real life for sure. I mean, I don't think the line between real life and the internet is so sharp where they don't influence each other, and I don't think it's only real life to the internet, right, which we've been talking about. I think in some way, and who knows how much and who knows in what ways and what specific instances, but I think yeah, things that we do online can certainly affect how we behave in the real world, and that feedback between the two is something that we definitely do need to explore.
Yeah, and when, at the very least, we know that negative behavior, negative engagement online gives us more negative emotions. So positive behavior, positive engagement can give us more positive emotions. And if that's the only transference that occurs from online to offline, even that's something, right? People could use that. I mean, Fisher's whole argument is that if people are well and healthy, then things can even begin to start changing. And if people are not well and healthy, then we cannot even have that conversation. So in this extremely online 2020 is the extremely online year, right? I mean, like I said, I've been extremely online since 2001. So this is like fine for me, but for a lot of other people that have like now had to like learn to create society online, like we need to learn to draw boundaries between our online and offline selves, because becoming one with our online self can have very like toxic consequences. So a healthy thing to do is think about how our online selves can nurture our offline selves, and try to engage in the internet with that intention, right? So speaking of like hyper reality again, internet only exists as hyper reality, right? Reality is offline. Like this is the perfect like way to describe like Fisher's idea of hyper reality. So like we create online hyper reality via our narratives, right? Speaking about reality as narratives, like online realities, the narratives we're co-creating, collectively creating. And one of the things to do is to learn to go offline. When is a good time to go offline? And the other thing to know is, how can we change the narrative? That's what this conversation has been about. Because when you cancel culture is the perfect example. Like the narrative around cancel culture ultimately to me is pointless, because it's not, nobody's even talking about the same thing to begin with. Everybody's talking about something else when they mean cancel culture, and it's just such a like a accusatory defensive mechanism of like speaking about internet culture. So why should we even have that narrative? If we stop engaging in that narrative ceases to exist. Then that makes room for a new collective narrative, right? So how can we change the narrative, and what should we change the narrative to? That's the big question. Do you want to take a stab at what should we change the narrative to?
Wait, sorry, which narrative?
So like just like the collective internet narrative, right? Like instead of, when you think about internet culture, like a few things come in mind, and cancel culture is one of them. So what could be in place of it, right? So I have a follow-up question that might help. So how do we overcome the alienation of isolation and exile and psychological violence by online media during this pandemic? How do we change the conversation to something that is healthy for everybody's sake? And essentially, like, what should we be talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the conversation around cancel culture is still vague, and I think it needs a lot more people thinking a lot more clearly, and not being defensive, right? I mean, pro anti cancel culture, pro anti something that encompasses all these different things is just not a useful way to have a conversation. You have people defensively in one camp or the another, and they talk past each other all the time. And that's why, You have everything from it doesn't exist, it does exist, it's good, it's bad, it's, you know, just that too many, you know, people can't even agree what they're looking at. So it definitely is a conversation that framing of cancel culture is not really helping us talk about the what we're seeing online, right? It's too vague. It's something that means too much to too many different people, right? And if it's so vague, it's no surprise you have people, you know, good and bad, and can't agree what they're seeing. Um, how do we change the conversation? That's tough. I mean, I think it's yeah. I mean, it's a conversation about a conversation almost. I'm not sure how we sort of change it, except for maybe maybe there's a different way that we have to talk about what we see as cancel culture, right? Or maybe we need to start seeing things in a different way and start seeing what other maybe there's a different concept that I mean we talked about we made up some on the spot here, right? And you don't have to like stick with those, but maybe there's different even ways of thinking and talking about these problems that could be clear, and maybe starting that conversation something that we could do. um
Yeah.
how do we overcome the alienation and isolation of online media during the crisis? That second question.
Yes.
Um,
I put it into one big nonsensical question, but yes, parse it better.
um, yeah, I mean now it's tough because like we're kind of forced to be to be online. We're not necessarily forced to be on social media per se, but you know, not a lot of other things that we can do to talk to each other. So I don't know. I mean, maybe that just means it's a better time to do this. I mean, maybe that just means now is the time to start figuring out if we're going to be using it so much. What do we want to use this for? How can we start behaving in different ways on social media? You know, if it's not sort of just an outlet for our random emotions before we go to bed, if it's something we're going to be on this much, maybe we need to start thinking about how do we utilize it in the most positive way possible, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, maybe this contradicts what I just said, but at the same time, also knowing how to get offline. I mean, we're kind of forced to use it a lot more than we were in the past, but you know, there are other things you can do. Surprising as it may be, even without seeing and talking to other people, there are things that you could do
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
as a solo person, right? I mean, I don't know what your hobbies are, students, but I'm sure you have them, or you know, it's good to have them.
Yeah. Yeah.
That and you know, also, yeah. I mean, I guess just the isolation, the sort of violence we commit on each other. I mean, that's something that I think we need to. Maybe now is a good time to take stock of how much we use online, why we use it, and realize that it's up to us. We could use it any way we want to. It you know, online social media are tools, and you know we should be using them. They shouldn't be using us.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think there's a unique opportunity online because online culture can be changed without the same kind of opposition, right? Offline, like anytime you try to like make sweeping cultural changes, we're up against very powerful forces here, like capitalism, imperialism, racism. Like these are like heavy influences. But online, it's mostly people a lot of the times anonymously engaging with one another. Like it's not a free platform. I know a lot of like companies are like data mining and whatnot, like Zoom's recording this conversation, it's fine, it's going to be on YouTube. But like beyond that, it's sort of the oppositional force of what can be created, what how society can be organized is not as powerful online, right? Online society has more of a leeway to restructure itself without experiencing external like forces that try to stop it in the same way it happens in offline society, right? Since you know we're all online, like we can collectively decide to reorganize the internet in a way that is mutually beneficial as opposed to beneficial for like capitalist realism. But in order to do that, yeah, we need to do all the things we said, like go offline sometimes, use the internet mindfully, engage with each other, respect each other's boundaries, learn, do other things with your time. And I think like maybe instead of cancel culture, we can think about collective culture. It's not a really like cool snazzy term, but maybe that can be internet's culture, right? It can be a space to experiment what collective solidarity can really do, like in terms of the culture. And then there's still an empirical question of how, if or how that will transpose into the real world. But if we don't try, we won't know. That's the whole point, right? If we don't try, we'll never know. And we have to start somewhere. And the internet is a good place to start. And right now it is a good time to start, like you said. I think that's a very important point as well. Like if there was ever a time to like socially experiment in reorganizing how we relate with one another, it would be now. And we have the medium to do so. It's kind of wild, right? That this medium exists. We can practice these things ostensibly without like doing it in real life. So I think that those are all like very important points. And before we end here today, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to add anything at all broadly in relation to any of these topics, or any advice you might have for my students on their collective assignment.
So their collective assignment is making up rules for a new internet. Is that correct?
So like a citizenship guidelines, like a blueprint for internet engagement and culture. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think just maybe two things I think of as key was our discussion about recognizing good and bad faith arguments, right? Honest people versus the trolls and whatever. And then, extending sort of a open invitation for conversation, and until someone really proves to you otherwise, right? Extending that first openness towards having communication, being open to communication as a way that can be very productive, right? You don't have to immediately be defensive, right? So looking at how to collaboratively communicate in a way that's productive rather than just seeing it as conflict, right? Or I mean, there's conflict, but conflict can be productive. It doesn't have to be, it's not a zero-sum game. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's like knowing that if there is conflict, approaching it as an opportunity for both parties to learn and grow from it rather than disintegrate into this like psychological prison that we sometimes find ourselves in, right?
That, yeah.
Just summarizing. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
no, that's exactly it.
that's great. That's very important advice. And my last advice would be to remember the go offline advice. It's like know when to go offline. Know when to go offline and know what you're online for. I mean, obviously when you have to do like work, it's different, but like, when you're engaging on the internet for fun, like you have to draw your own boundaries and you are responsible for your own reactions, your own emotional stability online, and your own knowledge and what you know. So those are all things to think about. Well, I think that's all we have, unless any last words from you.
Nope.
Okay, well, thank you very much for spending another afternoon with us.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, I'm sure this will be very valuable for the students. All right, I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you.